Good evening. I'm Aryeh Nair, and as Arian Mack indicated, I am to moderate the discussion this evening. Arian mentioned that I had an opportunity to take part in the events of the 50th anniversary of the University in Exile. Jonathan Fanton, on my left, was fairly newly installed as the president of the new school at that time, and I owe my engagement in the events of the 50th anniversary to his invitation to take part. I want to mention this particularly because I'm looking forward to an invitation to take part in the 100th anniversary of the University in Exile. But I do want to start with that 50th anniversary because, Jonathan, you were fairly new at the new school at that time, and my sense was that your own participation in those events had a significant impact on the way in which you acted as president of the new school. Samantha talked about some of the challenges that we face today in defending academic freedom and defending freedom of expression, but we also face challenges at that point 30 years ago. And I wonder if you'd say a little bit about the way in which the new school responded to the challenges of that period.
Well, thank you, RAA, and I owe a great debt to you for involving me in Human Rights Watch. And you may recall asking me to organize the Committee on Academic Freedom, which we
and I should say, Jonathan became the chairman of Human Rights Watch.
But you have played a huge part in my education about human rights abuses and how to combat them. I'm also indebted to Professors Jeffrey Goldfarb and Andrew Arado, and later Elzbieta Matinya, Ira Katz-Nelson, and others for their work in helping the new school take an interest in scholars at risk facing repression in East and Central Europe during the 1980s before the opening. And Jeff and Andrew and Elzbieta used to organize underground seminars in Hungary and Poland, what was then Czechoslovakia. And over the years, we've worked with hundreds of scholars, first in the smuggling out their manuscripts to be published in the West, but later, when those countries opened up, working to rebuild the social sciences, fields that have been highly politicized, but through a series of democracy seminars, visiting professorships, Arian Mack's journal donation project, the new school took a real interest in, and I think played a very important role in rebuilding the social sciences. Looking there at Bill Hurst, who was active in helping teach and revive psychology. I think it was Romania, and Ann Snitow, who worked on gender studies. So that 50-year ago commemoration of the University in Exile really heightened my consciousness of the continuing obligation of the new school to work with scholars at risk and institutions at risk.
Let me turn to George Rupp, because in addition to serving as president of Columbia University, you served until very recently as the president of the International Rescue Committee. And to some degree, the International Rescue Committee is known for humanitarian activities overseas. But in its early days, I would say that the International Rescue Committee was probably best known for resettling in the United States a large number of people who were refugees from Nazi Germany and from other totalitarian countries, and itself played a significant role in maintaining the opportunity for intellectuals to participate in freedom of expression and rescuing them in and maintaining their ability to engage in such activities. And I wonder if you'd reflect on this from the standpoint of having both served as president of a major university and as president of the International Rescue Committee.
Well, Aryeh, I'd be happy to do that. I wish that the role of Columbia in all of the history of the New School were unambiguously positive. There certainly are some positive features to it, but as many of you know, the initial founding of the New School was precipitated by the fact that Columbia, in the person of the president, Nicholas Murray Butler, managed to attempt to intimidate some really crucial faculty members, Charles Beard and James Harvey Robinson for two, that they resigned and pledged that they would found a new university here. So in some ways, the connections of Columbia to the New School are ones that I am not at all proud of, but it is important to recognize that there is that connection. But it had a better record
somewhat later on.
Well, over time, we shared Ira Katz Nelson. We had lots of other interactions, but I just want to acknowledge, even as we salute the New School, which I certainly want to do. I think it's a terrific story that we're celebrating, and there's no question that the New School has stood proud and tall for freedom of expression and scholarly inquiry, and I think it's important for us to salute that, and I can't help but say I wish that the initial role of Columbia were somewhat different. But happily, you said, you called attention to my role not only as president of Columbia, but also as the president of the International Rescue Committee, and you very nicely summarized our own genesis, which was and just about the same time as the founding of the University in Exile. And we were founded because Albert Einstein suggested it would be good to have a committee of notables who rescued those who were being oppressed by Nazi occupation of Europe, and then brought them to this country and let them get back on their feet. So the origins were really very similar. And in those earliest rescue missions that Varian Fry organized in Marseille, intellectuals and writers and artists were very prominent among those who were resettled, and that really begins a much more productive relationship that the International Rescue Committee had with the New School and in particular with the University in Exile.
You know, Aryeh, if George Rupp had been president of Columbia in 1917, 18, 19, we wouldn't be sitting here today. There'd be no new school if George had been president.
Okay. But listening to Samantha and talking about the challenges that we face today, how do you see the role of American universities? Do you see American universities playing a significant part in dealing with the kinds of challenges that she talked about? Is the role that the New School played in the 1930s one that is reflected in some fashion by the role that American universities are playing today? Could American universities be doing significantly more than they are now doing with respect to these challenges? Both of you have headed universities, so I think you can approach this question from the standpoint of somebody who has many responsibilities while heading a university, and is this one that you can take on?
Well, yes. I'm also chair of Scholars at Risk, which Samantha Power mentioned. It's a great organization. It places well, first of all, it's a network of over 300 universities all over the world, many of which are in the U.S. And it places, last year, maybe 60 scholars it rescued, scholars from Latin America, from Syria, from Iraq, from Pakistan, from the Congo, scholars who faced harassment, even death threats. And it also helped another 190 scholars who didn't leave their home country, but who might be in prison and needed advocacy to help get out. But that was only scratching the surface. There's some couple thousand cases easily that we knew of, and we didn't have the resources or the placements to take care of everyone. So I think there's a big job ahead for universities all over the world, including in America, not just to accept scholars who have been rescued, but to help them make a longer-term commitment to them, not just for the year of rescue, but sometimes a placement that might go on for many years before they're able to go home.
George?
Well, I have a very similar reaction. The Scholars at Risk Network is an organization that, as Samantha said, is based at NYU. Jonathan's been very involved in it from the beginning. The Scholars at Risk Network works very closely with the Scholar Rescue Fund, which is part of the Institute for International Education. And I've been on the board of both the Scholar Rescue Fund and the IIE for a long time. I mean, just to give, it is just scratching the surface. Jonathan, and you're absolutely right about that. But the numbers nonetheless show what can be done. Scholar Rescue Fund has supported 800 scholars in various countries, has partnerships with 300 academic institutions in 8 countries, has raised private funds of more than $20 million for those purposes, and then had matching funds from universities of another $10 million. Now, those are all very important initiatives, but they are only drops in the bucket given the overall needs. And what does have to happen is a further cultivation of the networks with universities and providing placements and matching funds, with individual donors. Henry Jarecki's been, as you know, a very major donor to the Scholar Rescue Fund, and Mark Angelson is now doing the same. But also needed are public monies. And here I think much work has to be done in order to generate the kind of commitment that Samantha wonderfully expressed, but that kind of commitment from the State Department, modest amounts of money that leverage the private funds that an organization like SRF has raised, go a long way to providing places for scholars to be in universities, not only in this country, but also in other universities around the world. In the case of the Middle East now, in Middle Eastern universities, with the prospect of support for them until they're able to return. And that's really what is, I think, critical. And if I relate it back to the International Rescue Committee, our tagline is from harm to home. And the key is to rescue people, but then get them back on their feet, either in this country, if they can be integrated into universities here, or back home when it's safe to go back home, or in another institution somewhere else in the world. Yeah. And that's a huge challenge we all need to be involved in.
I would add to that there's a sense of hopelessness about the situation in Syria, a sort of lack of consensus about what could possibly be done about the situation. But one thing that could be done is that Syrian universities have essentially been destroyed during this period, and there are many scholars from the Syrian universities who desperately need some kind of assistance. And if one can sustain that intellectual segment in Syria, it is one of the few things that could be significant at some stage in the rebuilding of a country that is being so completely destroyed.
Well, Samantha mentioned the European Humanities University, yes. And I think that's not a bad model. that there could well be a Syrian university in exile. I had the privilege of speaking at the reopening of EHU when it moved to Vilnius, and it is thriving. And someday, we hope, we'll be back in Minsk. But in the meantime, is training a new generation of Belarusian young people who will be prepared to take up leadership positions someday when their country returns to some semblance or achieves some semblance of democracy. I'd say that you ask about what could be done. Rescue is one thing, but I think there are two other dimensions of what Scholars at Risk is trying to do. The first is monitoring, really learning from your work at Human Rights Watch to, we now have in Africa 19 volunteers who have identified 200-300 cases just last year of scholars at risk, but not yet to the point where they had to be rescued or taken out of country. And I think one goal is to spot these situations early, get early warning, and then to bring international and other pressures to get at the problem. There's yet one additional role that organizations like ours can play, and that is, let's call it promotion. And I take Tunisia as an example, where Scholars at Risk has been active. In fact, had a conference there with university leaders from around the world to talk about academic freedom. At the time, Tunisia was drawing up a new constitution. The constitution process in Tunisia goes on. It's not done yet. And the process requires each provision, each article to be ratified. But I'm happy to tell you 2 weeks ago, the article that made academic freedom a protected right was approved and presumably will be incorporated. So promotion, getting out ahead, and setting the normative framework is something else we can work on.
George?
You mentioned the example of Syria in particular. Yes. Maybe we could get back for a minute to that. First of all, to emphasize, as you did, or to use Jonathan's metaphor, we're just scratching the surface with what we're doing in terms of rescuing scholars. It's very important that we do it, but just a few data points on how catastrophic the situation is. They're in a country of 22 million people. Over 7 million are displaced, have lost their homes. 2 million are in the surrounding countries as refugees. The needs are enormous, and as we now are in the third winter for Syrians, it is a crisis of humanitarian proportions that is almost beyond comprehension. It's certainly the worst that we have seen in any crisis in the last 2 decades. The International Rescue Committee is involved in Syria itself and in all of the surrounding countries, so Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq. And we've spent over $50 million in programs there. But again, $50 million, given the needs, is only scratching the surface. More specifically to your question, namely, what to do about the scholars and other intellectuals who need rescuing, I mentioned one feature of this conflict that is as distressing as any other. Medical professionals have been targeted. I met with a heart surgeon in Gaziantep, Turkey, who told me he was from Aleppo originally, the largest city in Syria. He had watched the decimation of the medical community in Aleppo. He said before the war started, there were about 500 doctors in and around Aleppo. He said there were 36 left now. The rest of them had either been killed or had fled. And
a large number are also imprisoned in
also
Syria.
in prison. And the reason they're targeted is because they're doing what they're called to do as doctors, namely caring for people who are sick and wounded. So the crisis is really enormous. That said, The Scholar at Risk Network and the Scholar Rescue Fund are working hard to find placements for scholars who managed to get out of Syria. And in the case of the Scholar Rescue Fund, there now been over 40 refugee scholars placed, some of them in this country, most of them in neighboring countries to Iraq. That's been almost all done with private funding. So again, there's a great need to leverage private funding with more public funds. I'll give you one figure that just is too awful not to mention. At this point, 3 years into this war, only 100 refugees have been admitted to the United States from Syria. 100. Out of the 7 million displaced, 2 million refugees, 100. Now there are reasons for that. I mean, there's a material support criterion that if the person can be suspected of having given any assistance whatsoever to some terrorist person or organization, he or she can't be admitted. But we had similar problems in Iraq. The special immigrant visa program was developed by Senator Kennedy and the person who now is our vice president in Washington, Sharon Waxman, and that allowed 5,000 Iraqis to come in. Something like that needs to be done in order to facilitate the admission to the United States of scholars and others who are without question refugees.
If I can turn the discussion in a different direction, American universities have a role and to some extent are fulfilling their role in dealing with the denial of academic freedom in many repressive countries. But there is another role that American universities are playing which can also have a significant impact on academic freedom. And that is quite a lot of American universities are establishing branches or establishing relationships with universities in the Middle East, in China, in Singapore, in other places where there are difficulties with academic freedom. In some cases, the governments don't allow certain topics to be discussed in the classroom. They don't allow certain materials to appear in textbooks. They limit the rights of expression of their own nationals who teach in those universities. At the same time, American universities often argue that by engaging with countries like that, they are contributing to freedom of expression in those countries. Are there standards that we can apply in thinking about how to deal with those circumstances? Should American universities simply stay away from countries that are highly repressive? Can they put conditions on their engagement in those countries? How do you see this issue?
Well, I have I guess a bias towards engagement as opposed to staying away. And I think it's important how the engagement takes place. I do think university leaders have gotten themselves in trouble when they have worked on their own without getting their home campus faculty in support and participating in the engagement. I think it's tricky when you take a lot of money for physical construction as opposed to having a lighter presence. I think it is important if you're going to go into a country where there are limits on not only freedom of expression, you didn't mention, but also freedom of assembly, that there be a memorandum of understanding worked out at the time of entry. Understanding it might not be perfect protection in the words that we would most prefer, but at least it would be pushing the envelope some.
But what if you get a directive from a government that certain topics are forbidden, or the writings of certain persons are forbidden? Let me take it back a stage. Suppose we were now dealing with South Africa during the apartheid period. And in South Africa during the apartheid years, you couldn't mention a banned person. You couldn't quote a banned person. So that if somebody had tried to quote Nelson Mandela or refer to Mandela, that would have been forbidden by the South African government. Under those circumstances, would it be tolerable for a university to establish a program in South Africa and submit to that directive of the apartheid government?
Well, let me talk for a minute about forms of engagement.
Okay.
We have two clear models in New York. NYU has made a big physical investment in Abu Dhabi. Columbia, and I see Ken Pruitt here, who's had a role in this, has taken a different approach, which is to have centers around the world, including in some countries that could be challenging. But Columbia has the ability to withdraw in a circumstance where an understanding at point of entry has been breached, where if you have a big physical campus, it's much harder to...
You're a hostage.
You're a hostage. So I think a couple things. One, when you go in, you need to see where a country is in the arc of its development. So if it's at a highly repressive moment, that's probably not a good time to go in. But there will be moments later on when a country begins or has made significant progress towards academic freedom and freedom of expression, where maybe that's the right moment to go in and you can push. So timing is important, but then I think the form, a light form as opposed to a heavy physical presence is important.
George?
Well, I agree completely with that way of framing the question. Number one, I agree with you, Jonathan, that engagement is better than just staying away. Number two, it does seem to me important that the ground rules be clear, and I, for one, would not favor establishing even a program, much less a physical facility, if in fact within the confines of that institution there were not freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry, so reading and whatever. And so if it was at the outset clear that was going to be off limits, that seems to me a very strong signal that that's not a place to go until that is changed. Now, I do agree that
the big attraction, though, is China. And we're not going to get to a point where there is freedom of expression in China within the foreseeable future.
Well, again, as Jonathan noted, I mean, there are different ways of being present in China. In the Columbia Center in China, or centers, within those centers, there certainly is freedom of expression. I don't mean that has changed the whole of the People's Republic of China, but insofar as there would be a step that would deprive, even within the center itself, of those freedoms, if I were in charge, I would say that's grounds for withdrawing. And that's where it's important that it be a light footprint, because I think the threat of withdrawing on principle is much more credible than if one has a huge physical plant that in some ways is dependent on the host government or the host country. I think it is possible to be present without being held hostage by too heavy a footprint. Let me give a couple of examples that are sort of on the edge of universities, or of the experience of universities. I mentioned the Scholar Rescue Fund. That's an example of an organization, because it's part of the Institute of International Education, that has a presence in some repressive countries, as the IIE. It recruits Fulbrights, it places Fulbrights, for example. So China would be an example where there is that presence. But we also, the Scholar Rescue Fund rescues scholars from China. That's an awkward polarity because, of course, the People's Republic of China can't be very pleased that this organization that has a presence there is arguing that there are scholars who need to be saved from the repressive regime that in other ways the IIE works with. So it's complicated, but I think it's not impossible to stand for principle while also having a presence as long as it's not too heavy a footprint. Take the International Rescue Committee as another example. We have, Jonathan knows this because Human Rights Watch and other advocacy organizations are partners with the IRC, but usually very quiet partners. We have a quite large presence in many countries. Hundreds of millions of dollars is not unusual, or it's unusual, but it's certainly not unprecedented. And that means we have all kinds of working relations with ministries of health, ministries of education, and so on. At the same time, we have strong principled views about what should and shouldn't be allowed. In some cases, instead of making big public protests, we get the appropriate information to human rights organizations that don't have a footprint on the ground and therefore can be more vocal. Doesn't always work. I mean, we've been kicked out of countries because we were too vigorous, even by our restrained standards. So Sudan and Syria are two examples of countries where we've been expelled. But we work in a lot of other repressive countries, and we do get information about human rights abuses out, but we work in partnership with human rights organizations that can take a higher profile position than we can afford to do if we're not going to have the beneficiaries of our programs be suffering.
I would differentiate between an organization like the International Rescue Committee and an institution like Columbia University in this respect.
So
well, okay. I would say that in connection with a university like Columbia, when one establishes a presence in a country, it confers a certain amount of prestige on that country and on the educational institutions in that country. And I think one ought to be chary in terms of giving or lending that prestige when there are repressive circumstances, when there are significant violations of academic freedom. The International Rescue Committee is an organization that I admire, but it doesn't have that same aura about it when it goes into another country. And its humanitarian mission is specifically to deal with those persons who are suffering the most in the circumstances of that country. So I think a university may have some greater limits that it ought to impose upon itself than an organization like the International Rescue Committee.
Yeah, or a foundation.
Or a foundation.
You and I both have had experience, and I've written an essay really arguing that foundations ought to engage in repressive countries, but it's different. You're quite right.
Okay.
Well, I do think, and Jonathan's initial response, I think, made this point well. The university, if it does get engaged in a country that is repressive, to use your word, and if it does negotiate an understanding that is in the views of the university, including faculty and others, I mean, I think that's a good point, is defensible, then it is crucial that if that understanding is violated, that is to say, if there are constraints on the free expression within the center or the campus itself, then the university really is obliged to be prepared to withdraw as a matter of protest, and public protest, it seemed to me.
And the prestige factor cuts two ways, because host government doesn't want to lose the prestige of the
So universities have a certain amount of leverage, when
that's
they
right.
go into those countries.
And you know, when you look at, while I said I wasn't in favor of the large campus presence, but I am interested to watch what's happening with NYU. Human Rights Watch did a report looking at conditions of labor in the construction of the campus there, finding quite a lot of problems, but there have been some responses to those problems of poor working conditions. And so that's an example of where the presence does provide some leverage, which can make a difference in improving working conditions.
Do you think it would be helpful to try to draw up a kind of code of conduct for universities, standards which universities could debate, and that they might then join in adopting, and even be able to advise governments that they have to adhere to a code of conduct of that sort, and use that as a way of having further leverage on the governments?
I think that's a brilliant idea, and it ought to be pursued. I think that could be very effective.
I would agree with this caveat. It seems to me really important that code of conduct be framed very carefully, and that the focus of it be on the behavior that is insisted upon within this foreign institution. Because if
you can't transform the country.
well, that's
The only thing you can do is try to have an impact where you are directly engaged.
exactly, but the example will be very important. So I think it's a very good idea, because there will be ripple effects. I don't think there's any way around that. But if the conditions for going into a country are basically that the whole country has to subscribe to, the Bill of Rights or something, it's obviously not going to happen.
That'll never happen.
That's why I said a memorandum of understanding governing your own relations, your own campus. I think the other thing we want to remember is that even in the most repressive places, there are plenty of good people who understand what's going on and understand that it's wrong. And part of what we want to do through engagement is to support the good people in these countries who want change and understand that it can't happen overnight, but are going to work for it patiently and courageously.
Okay. We have a few minutes left, and there are microphones, and I wonder if people who would be interested in asking questions would go to the microphones and identify yourself in asking a question. And please only ask a question. Don't make a statement.
Oh. Are you sure? Okay. I'll put it as a question. I'm Sophie Cook of the Committee of Concerned Scientists. We're an advocacy group for academics, scientists, engineers, doctors. We work closely with scholars at risk, and most of our clients, most of our cases involve people in jail, so we try to keep their names alive. One of our less tragic cases is Professor Xia Liang, who was just fired from Peking University, and we've had 2 other cases of people being fired, one of them being jailed as well. I was wondering whether you were aware of how the faculty at Wellesley University reacted to Xia Liang's firing from Peking University. And I know I'm not supposed to make a statement, but the faculty got the university to appoint a committee to reconsider their relationship with Peking University. And I think that would serve as a very useful model for what you are talking about, of the relationship between American academia and their Chinese partners.
Okay. I'll take that really as a statement rather than as a question. And let me ask the next person. Is there just one mic over here? Or no, there's one over there. Why don't we go to that mic?
Oh, okay. Thanks. I just wanted to preface my question.
If you'd give us who you are.
Oh, my name is Daniel. Is that enough?
All right.
I just wanted to preface my question with just an expression of appreciation for the Scholars Program that you're hosting in your various universities. But it strikes me that we also have a problem here that's not being mentioned. We also suffer from repression in many ways, and it might be different from that encountered in communist nations or Islamic nations, but I think it's every bit as real. Let me give you a for instance. At NYU.
Do you have a question?
Yes. My question is, do you see a double standard here? And I want to give you the example. The example is a visiting legal scholar from Singapore was scheduled to come to NYU to teach for I don't know how long. It got out that she was in favor of the traditional family, and there was such a brouhaha that blocked her coming. Now, this is just, if that was the only problem, I wouldn't say anything, but there seems to be an endemic cultural bias where certain viewpoints are not allowed.
Okay. Any comments? I mean, I don't know the case, but if it's as you describe it, I assume that is not an appropriate action with respect to that scholar.
But do you recognize that there is an extensive cultural bias that is going on in regards to many,
many cultural biases that one
subjects
sees all the time?
But it's even worse than that.
Okay,
that professors are being denied tenure,
person, okay?
or denied.
Yeah.
I have a comment. I'm looking at Ira Katz-Nelson
over there, who was our dean and who chaired a committee at the new school on free expression. I do think there is an affirmative role here for a university to play to bring in unpopular points of view, and not just in a small classroom, but in a large setting. And that could be tough, and you've got to work hard to be sure the unpopular view is heard and not interrupted and shouted down. And Ira gave us a guidebook, really, for how to do that. And I am proud that in my time, all points of view could be heard here, and we really went out and encouraged conservative points of view that might offend people, but they should be heard and debated.
Let me just make a comment as well. Those of us who had the privilege of seeing the Hannah Arendt movie earlier know there is a classic case that does show the truth of your overall claim, namely that there can be all kinds of biases that try to constrain what is allowed to be said, and those need to be resisted in the way in which Arendt is a wonderful and eloquent example of doing so. And to pretend that we're all the time welcoming all points of view, I think would be naive. But we certainly do understand that the aspiration is to move in that direction. And I think that basic principle, although it is not always observed, is one that is not even expressed in some of the countries that REA has rightly characterized as repressive.
Okay, question over here.
Kenneth Pruitt from Columbia University, and I did indeed put the 8 centers together around the world. And I do have a question. I grant completely the position that's been taken that within our own domain, we obviously, if we are shut down, we leave. However, I want to ask you the question, are there conditions in which a country has become so repressive of scholarship, of inquiry, of speech, of press, that even if we're able to conduct our business the way we want to, we should still not be there?
Well, I think it's a good instance, a good example to keep in mind, and it may in fact then come down to the question of, is there any form of engagement that can do any good at all besides having a little island where there's free expression? I think if that's the case, then there would be grounds for leaving. But it seems to me that almost always, as long as within the center itself, to take Columbia language, there is a kind of free expression and freedom of inquiry and housing, including for those Chinese or Egyptian or whatever Ethiopian scholars who are there, then it seems to me almost always better to stay than to leave.
I'd say this, Ken.
In making the choice about where to go, I would not pick a country that was enormously repressive, even. Well, let me finish my point. So I think So I think there are 2 points. One is the point of entry, but the other is once you're there, how quickly would you withdraw if the circumstance changes? And I don't think you'd withdraw right away, in part because you have obligations to people that have had faith in you and taken some risk in being part of your enterprise. And so I think you have some obligation to stay as long as you can to protect them. But at some point, of course, you would shut it down.
Susan.
Hi, Susan Tucker. I'm thinking as I'm listening to the questions that we could all learn a lot from the way RAA articulates a question that has so much in it already, and yet really focuses attention. It's great. So my question really has to do with the question that you asked about what the universities could do about the kinds of issues that Samantha was talking about. And I was also waiting to hear sort of what you think about how we're teaching. I mean, it seems to me the university's under attack economically, in many different ways right now. They're hurting for students, let's say. But what should we be teaching with these scholars who are teachers? Is there something different we should be doing about the way we're educating ourselves? I guess that's my question.
You want to take that on?
I'm sure that we will have to continue to reinvent the way in which we go about doing our teaching and learning in universities, as we have only too slowly, because academic institutions are structurally quite rigid. But I cannot imagine we won't continue to have new ways of teaching and learning that we need to develop. And I can't quite imagine anyone would hold that we've come to the perfect way of doing that now. I certainly wouldn't.
The book I would recommend to you is by John Seeley Brown, called The Power of Pull. It's Power of Pull. And he essentially said we're moving from a world of push, where there was inherited wisdom and it came down, to a world of pull, where students are enabled to get information as they need it from lots of different sources, and that the lateral exchange of information is going to become increasingly important. And so I think there is technology is bringing upon us and a new generation a lot that universities have to think about, and no doubt will require some changes in how we teach.
Okay, I think we've got time really for one more question and the answers.
I'm Bob Levinson. I'm a former trustee of the World Policy Institute when it was affiliated with the New School, and I sit on the board of the New School for Public Engagement. I have two quick questions. One is talking about repressive governments and how we handle educational institutions. Why not just encourage social media, since that seems to be such a moving force in different parts of the world as we've observed? That's one question. The second question is, how do you feel about the academic institutions who have advocated boycotting Israel because of their policies with the Palestinians?
Well, on your first question, why not just enlist social media? I think it's terrific to enlist social media, but it does seem to me also valuable to have educational institutions or centers that recruit students, cultivate free expression, and so on. I have to say I'm unsympathetic to the really quite marginal move on the part of professional associations to boycott Israel. It does seem to me important that universities and professional associations insist that researchers be allowed to go into the Palestinian territories, and that scholars from Palestinian institutions and universities be enabled to come out. I think, in fact, those are achievable goals, and those are the ones I think would be better to be focused on than a much more blanket boycott that seems to me to have very little prospect of having an impact.
I agree with that, and let me say that the World Policy Institute enriched the intellectual environment of the New School greatly, and I'm sorry it's not here anymore. It's a great organization.
Okay. We have reached the time that we said we would end this program. I want to thank George Rupp and Jonathan Fanton. I think we've had a very good discussion. I think Samantha got us off to a very good start. And I'm pleased that all of you were able to participate this evening. And I look forward not only to taking part myself in the 100th anniversary of the University in Exile, but to seeing all of you at the occasion. Thank you.